The fluorescent lights in the ICU corridor hummed with that particular frequency that gets inside your skull after the 12th consecutive night shift, and nurse practitioner Marcus Chen had worked 16 of them in the last 3 weeks. St. Catherine's Memorial Hospital in Portland, Oregon, was chronically understaffed, a problem that had gone from concerning to dangerous after the latest round of budget cuts, and Marcus had volunteered for the overnight rotation because the differential pay meant he could finally afford to move his mother into the assisted living facility she desperately needed. It was 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November when the code blue alarm shattered the oppressive quiet of the third-floor critical care unit, the shrill electronic wail bouncing off institutional green walls that hadn't been repainted since the hospital's construction in 1987, and Marcus felt his heart rate spike in that familiar way it always did. That burst of adrenaline that transforms exhaustion into razor-sharp focus in the space between one breath and the next. He sprinted toward room 314, his sneakers squeaking against linoleum floors still damp from the evening cleaning, already running through the protocol in his head. Check airway, breathing, circulation, initiate CPR if necessary, prepare for intubation. But when he shouldered through the door with enough force to make it bang against the rubber stopper, he found the patient. An elderly man named Howard Dietrich who'd been admitted 3 days prior following a moderate stroke, sitting upright in bed with his eyes wide open, staring at the blank television screen mounted on the opposite wall. Howard's vitals on the monitor showed normal sinus rhythm, oxygen saturation at 97%, blood pressure slightly elevated but nothing approaching critical, and Marcus stood there in the doorway feeling his confusion crystallize into something colder, something that made the hair on his forearms stand up beneath his scrubs. "Mr. Dietrich." Marcus approached the bed slowly, the way you might approach a dog you're not entirely sure is friendly, and reached up to silence the shrieking code blue alarm that was still echoing through the hallway behind him. "Sir, are you all right?" Your call button went off. Howard didn't respond. He didn't blink. His eyes remained fixed on that dark television screen with an intensity that seemed wrong somehow, too focused, too deliberate, and his mouth hung slightly open in an expression that Marcus couldn't quite read. Not pain, not confusion, something else entirely. Marcus checked the call button panel, but it hadn't been pressed. He checked the automated monitoring system that would trigger a code blue if a patient's vitals crashed, but everything showed green across the board. He was reaching for Howard's wrist to manually check his pulse, more out of professional thoroughness than actual concern at this point, when the old man's head rotated toward him with mechanical precision, the movement so smooth and unnatural that Marcus actually took a step backward. "He's already here," Howard whispered, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat. "He's been here since they brought me up from radiology. He stands right there." Howard's arm rose slowly, one trembling finger pointing at the corner of the room near the ceiling where the walls met in shadow, and he counts backwards from 10, and when he gets to 1, someone dies. Marcus felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. He'd worked in hospitals long enough to know that stroke patients sometimes experienced hallucinations, that medications could cause confusion, that the elderly often became disoriented in unfamiliar environments, especially at night. He opened his mouth to offer reassurance, to explain about the stress Howard's brain had been under, but before he could speak, the code blue alarm erupted again, except this time it was coming from room 318, 4 doors down. Marcus hesitated, torn between staying with Howard, who was clearly experiencing some kind of psychological episode, and responding to what might be an actual medical emergency, and in that moment of indecision, Howard's hand shot out with surprising strength and grabbed Marcus's wrist. "He's at 7 now," Howard said, and there was something in his eyes that transcended confusion or medication-induced delirium, something ancient and knowing and absolutely terrified. "You need to understand, he counts for all of them. Everyone on this floor. And tonight he's going to reach one." Marcus pulled free and ran toward room 318, his rational mind trying to construct explanations for the malfunctioning equipment, for the impossible timing, but when he burst through that door he found the patient, a middle-aged woman recovering from gallbladder surgery, in the exact same position as Howard had been, sitting upright, eyes fixed on the television, mouth slightly open, that same expression of transfixed horror painted across her features. Her vitals were normal. The call button hadn't been pressed. And before Marcus could even process what he was seeing, a third alarm began screaming from room 321, then a fourth from room 316, and suddenly the entire ICU ward was lit up like a Christmas tree, every code blue alarm triggering simultaneously, 15 patients all at once, and Marcus stood frozen in that doorway while his mind tried and failed to make sense of what was happening. Dr. Sarah Vance, the attending physician on duty, came running from the nurse's station with 2 other staff members trailing behind her, and together they moved from room to room, checking patients who all showed the same impossible symptoms: normal vitals, that fixed stare, that peculiar expression, and when Dr. Vance demanded to know what had triggered the cascade of alarms, Marcus found he couldn't answer because he didn't know, because the monitoring system showed no failures, because every patient had been stable before this moment and was technically still stable now, at least according to every measurable metric modern medicine could provide. They spent the next 40 minutes going through every room, resetting alarms, checking and rechecking equipment, trying to find the technical glitch or system failure that would explain the simultaneous malfunction, and it was only when they'd finally restored quiet to the ward that Dr. Vance pulled Marcus aside and asked him, in a voice barely above a whisper, if he'd noticed anything unusual about the patients themselves. They were all staring at the same spot, Marcus said slowly, the realization forming even as he spoke the words. Upper right corner of their rooms. Like they were watching something we couldn't see. Dr. Vance's face went carefully neutral, that professional masked doctors wear when they don't want to reveal what they're thinking, and she told Marcus to document everything, every detail, and to flag the incident for the hospital's risk management team. She didn't say what Marcus could see she was thinking, what he was thinking too but didn't want to acknowledge, that 15 patients, all with different medical conditions, all on different medications, all with varying levels of cognitive function, had simultaneously experienced the exact same hallucination, had all looked at the exact same empty space, had all triggered their monitoring systems in the exact same way at the exact same moment. The rest of the night passed in tense, hyper-vigilant quiet, and Marcus found himself walking the corridor more frequently than necessary, checking on patients who didn't need checking, listening for sounds that weren't there. At 4:15 a.m., he was passing room 314 when he heard Howard Dietrich's voice, thin and reedy, counting 3, 2. Marcus's hand was on the door handle when the old man went silent. He waited, his pulse hammering in his ears, but Howard didn't say one. The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating, and Marcus pushed into the room to find Howard lying peacefully in his bed, eyes closed, chest rising and falling with regular breaths. The monitoring equipment showed everything normal. Marcus was turning to leave when Howard's eyes snapped open, and the old man looked directly at him with perfect clarity and said, "He stopped. I don't know why he stopped. But Marcus, he wrote down your name." Marcus didn't sleep after his shift ended. He went home to his small apartment in southeast Portland and sat on his couch watching the morning light creep across his living room while his coffee went cold in his hands, trying to convince himself that he'd experienced nothing more than a bizarre technical malfunction combined with the power of suggestion and his own exhaustion. He almost succeeded. He went back for his next shift 2 nights later, and the ICU was normal, quiet, just the usual sounds of monitoring equipment and ventilators and the soft conversations of night staff. Howard Dietrich had been transferred to a rehabilitation facility. The cascade alarm incident had been attributed to an electrical surge that somehow bypassed the backup systems, a 1 in a million glitch that the hospital's engineer swore they'd corrected. Everything was fine until 2:47 a.m. exactly, when every code blue alarm on the 3rd floor triggered simultaneously again, and Marcus ran to the rooms to find 15 different patients. The turnover meant only 3 had been there during the first incident, all sitting upright, all staring at that same corner, all with that same expression of transfixed horror. This time, though, there was something else. Every single television in every single room had turned itself on, all tuned to static, all with the volume at maximum, filling the ward with a roaring white noise that seemed to vibrate in Marcus's bones. And standing at the far end of the corridor, visible for just a moment before the emergency lighting flickered, Marcus saw a figure, tall and impossibly thin, wearing what might have been a hospital gown or might have been something else entirely. And in the strobing light he could have sworn he saw it raise one long arm and point directly at him before the light stabilized and the hallway was empty again. The hospital brought in specialists. They tested every electrical system, every monitoring device, every square inch of wiring in the third-floor ICU. They found nothing. The incidents continued, always at 2:47 a.m., always the same pattern, and each time Marcus noticed something new. The way the temperature in the corridor would drop by 10 degrees in the minutes before the alarms triggered. The way shadows seemed to pull and thicken in that upper right corner of every patient room. The way some patients would whisper about the man who counted, though they'd been admitted after Howard Dietrich was discharged and should have had no way of knowing about that particular detail. The hospital administration tried to keep it quiet, but word spread anyway, the way these things always do, and soon nurses were refusing to work the night shift on the third floor, and the staff that remained reported feeling watched, followed, measured by something they couldn't quite see but knew with absolute certainty was there. Marcus finally did what he'd been avoiding for weeks. He went to the hospital's archives and started digging through old records, incident reports, mortality statistics, looking for any pattern that might explain what was happening. What he found made his hands shake so badly he could barely turn the pages. Starting in November of 1987, the month the hospital had first opened, there had been an unexplained spike in patient deaths on the third floor between the hours of 2 o'clock and 4 a.m. The incidents occurred in clusters, 15 to 20 deaths compressed into a 2-week period, then nothing for exactly 1 year before the pattern repeated. The hospital had conducted investigations, the medical board had gotten involved, and each time they'd found no evidence of malpractice, no indication of equipment failure, no common cause that could link the deaths together. The patients died of different things: cardiac arrest, respiratory failure, stroke, aneurysm. But they all went into crisis at almost exactly 2:47 a.m., and in several of the older incident reports, Marcus found nurses' notes that mentioned patients becoming agitated and fixated on empty spaces in the minutes before their conditions deteriorated. The pattern had continued for years before gradually diminishing, the deaths becoming less frequent, until by the mid-2000s they'd stopped entirely. But now they were back, or at least the precursor was back. The alarms, the simultaneous patient reactions, the sense of something moving through the ward like a predator selecting prey. Marcus took his findings to Dr. Vance, expecting skepticism or dismissal, but instead he saw recognition in her eyes, and she told him something she'd learned from the previous head of critical care, something that wasn't in any official record, that in late 1986, during the hospital's construction, a worker had fallen from scaffolding on what would become the third floor and had lain there, dying, 4 hours before anyone found him, and supposedly, though this was just rumor, just whispered conversation among staff who'd worked there long enough to remember, supposedly he'd counted down the minutes of his life, his voice growing fainter as he counted, until finally going silent somewhere between 1 and 0. Marcus doesn't work at St. Catherine's Memorial anymore. He transferred to a different hospital across town, took a pay cut, moved his mother to a less expensive facility. But sometimes, in the dead space of night when he's driving home after a long shift, he'll glance in his rearview mirror and see headlights that seem to follow him for too long, maintaining that same distance no matter how many turns he makes. And sometimes, in the moment between waking and sleeping, he hears counting, distant, patient, inevitable, and he wonders if Howard Dietrich was right, if something in that hospital really did write down his name, and if the counting he hears is meant for him, numbers descending towards some unknowable moment when all debts come due and all watchers reveal themselves. If you've ever felt that chill in a hospital hallway, tell your story in the comments, and join us for the next descent into darkness.